Cheryl Reeve and ESPN praising Cheryl Reeve as she was wearing a shirt saying, "Trans kids belong." During the game. This is gross.
Well, we see Cheryl Reeve wearing a shirt today in support of trans kids. Trans kids belong on the shirt. This in the aftermath of Sophie Cunningham.
That is the moment everything stopped being just a basketball game. Because before you even get to the final score, before you get to Caitlin Clark's shooting night, before you get to the missed whistles, the bench problems, or Minnesota looking like a real problem, the broadcast itself put Cheryl Reeve's shirt front and center. And once ESPN framed it as a response to Sophie Cunningham's recent comments, this game became something bigger than a regular season matchup.
And yesterday, Cheryl Reeve spent a lot of time talking at length with the media about this topic.
I would encourage anyone to go and listen to Cheryl Reeve's comments. Incredibly thoughtful, easy to find online.
I would encourage anybody to go see Cheryl Reeve's comments. By the way, Sophie did not look like she backed down from Cheryl Reeve.
And listen to that wording. The broadcast is not just saying Cheryl Reeve wore a shirt. They are telling the audience to go find her comments, calling them thoughtful, and placing it directly in the aftermath of Sophie Cunningham. That matters because this is the exact kind of moment where fans feel like the league is no longer just covering basketball. They feel like the broadcast is taking a side in a cultural fight, then asking everybody watching to accept that side as the reasonable one. But the part that should actually bother people comes later, because while all this attention is being placed on the message on the shirt, there are plays on the floor where Indiana players are getting hit, calls are going the wrong way, and the same people telling fans to pay attention to the statement seem a lot less interested in asking why the game itself was officiated the way it was.
This is right here. Sophie Cunningham, by the way, took a ugly elbow in this game, and the refs called the foul against her. Let's just look at this. Bam! Hit her right in the jaw. And the refs, they swallowed their whistles. I'd love to know why.
That is the first basketball flashpoint. Sophie Cunningham takes an elbow to the jaw, and according to the reaction in the source clip, the foul goes against her. Now, you can debate intent. You can debate whether it was reckless, incidental, or part of normal contact in a physical game. But what you cannot debate is why that clip gets people fired up. Because the emotional setup had already been built. Sophie was already at the center of a wider controversy. Cheryl Reeve was already being praised on the broadcast while wearing a shirt that was being interpreted as a direct answer to Sophie. Then Sophie takes a shot to the face, and the whistle does not land the way Fever fans think it should land. That is how a game turns into a grievance machine. It is not one play by itself. It is one play stacked on top of the broadcast framing, stacked on top of the pre-game conversation, stacked on top of fans already believing certain players are treated differently depending on what they say, who they play for, and which side of the cultural argument they are perceived to be on. And even if you disagree with that read, this is why the clip spread. Because to a lot of viewers, it looked like the WNBA had a political spotlight bright enough to see a t-shirt from across the arena, but somehow not enough light to clearly see an elbow to the jaw.
Bye. Lynx defeated the Fever 108-100, and you could see the deficiencies in this team showed out. The bench is not deep enough. There's not enough length on this team. Again, we were saying that as free agency was going on. And then the draft, when it really blew up, and they took Raven Johnson instead of a big. And they got rid of Justine Passat. It felt like the Fever never had a chance in this game.
Now, underneath all of that, there was still a game. And this is where the Fever have a real problem that has nothing to do with shirts, slogans, rallies, or broadcast commentary. Minnesota beat Indiana 108-100. That is not a blowout on the scoreboard, but the way the game felt matters. The Fever were chasing. The Lynx had answers. Indiana had moments, but Minnesota looked like the team with more bodies, more size, more balance, and more ways to hurt you. That is why this result stings, because when you are building around Caitlin Clark, every roster choice gets magnified. Every bench minute matters. Every missing piece becomes obvious. And in this game, the same questions that were there in the off-season showed up again. Is there enough length? Is the bench deep enough? Is there enough front-court insurance? Did Indiana build the kind of roster that can survive against the league's best teams when the game gets physical and the whistle gets weird? The answer from this game was not comforting, because Minnesota did not need one miracle performance to beat Indiana. They had multiple players who could create, finish, and punish mistakes. That is the difference between a dangerous team and a complete team. Indiana can be dangerous. Minnesota looked complete.
They're real good. Caitlin Clark had a double-double, 19 points on 8 of 18, struggled from 3, 2 of 9. She had 2 wide-open threes. Late in the fourth, she missed them both. It was brutal. 10 assists. Kelsey Mitchell had a huge day. 37 points, 14 of 21, 6 of 8 from three-point range. For Kelsey, she actually did have 3 assists. And that's pretty much where it started and stopped. Yeah, AB had 15 points, 8 boards, and 7 assists. And those stats felt really hollow in this game.
This is the strange part about Caitlin Clark's stat line. 19 points and 10 assists sounds productive. For most guards, that is a strong night. But with Caitlin, the standard has already moved so high that a double-double can still feel like a frustrating game. She went 8 for 18 overall, but the 2 for 9 from 3 is the number that changes the story. Especially when the source points out those 2 wide-open threes late in the fourth. Those are the shots that usually flip the mood of an entire arena. Those are the shots that become replay clips. Those are the shots that turn a close loss into another Caitlin Clark moment. And she missed them. That does not erase the 10 assists. It does not erase the fact that she was still creating offense. It does not mean she played badly in some cartoonish way. But it does show how thin the fever margin is against a team like Minnesota. Kelsey Mitchell can go nuclear. Aaliyah Boston can fill a stat sheet. Caitlin can still produce. And it still might not be enough if the roster around them cannot match Minnesota's depth and physical profile. That is why a game like this feels so brutal. It is not just that Indiana lost. It is that they got a preview of the kind of matchup where one cold shooting stretch, one bad whistle, one missed challenge, or one dead bench stint can be the difference between stealing a statement win and walking away saying, "We were close." Close is not the same as ready.
10 assists. Kelsey Mitchell had a huge day. 37 points, 14 of 21, 6 of 8 from three-point range. For Kelsey, she actually did have 3 assists. And that's pretty much where it started and stopped. Yeah, AB had 15 points, 8 boards, and 7 assists. And those stats felt really hollow in this game. Sophie Cunningham, she really only got two looks in the game. Only took 2 shots. 3 points. Michaela Timpson, 7 points on 3 of 4. Michaela Timpson should be playing more in these games. Lexi Hall should be playing less in these games. 14 minutes had 6 points, but just not contributing to this team in the way that you would hope.
Kelsey Mitchell's game deserves its own spotlight here, because 37 points on 14 of 21 shooting is not just solid support. That is a star-level scoring performance. 6 of 8 from 3, efficient, aggressive, timely, and she even had 3 assists, which matters because one of the long-running questions with Indiana has been how the ball moves when Caitlin is being pressured and when Mitchell is hunting her own shot. But this is where the box score can fool you. Indiana had major production from Mitchell, real playmaking from Clark, and a busy line from Boston, yet the game still tilted toward Minnesota. That tells you the problem is not just, somebody needs to score more. Indiana scored 100 points. The offense did not completely disappear. The problem is what happens in the gaps. What happens when the starters sit? What happens when the opposing guards keep getting downhill? What happens when Sophie Cunningham only gets 2 shot attempts? What happens when Michaela Timpson gives you positive minutes but does not play more? What happens when Lexi Hull is out there and the contribution is not matching the matchup? What happens when Mahisha Hines-Allen goes from significant minutes to barely being part of the game? Those are not small details. Those are rotation details, and rotation details decide playoff-style games. Because against the bottom half of the league, talent can cover mistakes. Caitlin can create enough. Mitchell can catch fire. Boston can get you through rough patches. But against a team like Minnesota, the weak spots are not hidden. They are hunted.
Truly. Mahisha Hines-Allen, missing in action. I don't know what's going on there exactly. I really don't. She was playing significant minutes, and she had 2 minutes in this game. And Monique Billings has a good game about every 7 games. This was not one of them.
That 2-minute note about Mahisha Hines-Allen is one of the quietest but most important parts of the whole breakdown. Because when a player has been part of the rotation, then suddenly barely plays in a matchup where size and physicality matter, fans are going to ask questions. Was it matchup-based? Was it trust? Was it something in practice? Was it a coaching decision that simply did not work out? We do not know from this clip, and it would be unfair to invent an answer. But the question itself is valid. Indiana has been trying to figure out how to balance skill, spacing, defense, toughness, and chemistry around Caitlin Clark. That is not easy. Every Caitlin-led possession attracts attention. Every defensive mistake becomes a highlight for the other team. Every lineup has to answer 2 questions at once. Can it score? And can it survive? Against Minnesota, too many of those answers were shaky, and that is why fans keep circling back to the off-season. Because when you watch Minnesota roll out different looks, different scorers, different athletes, and then you watch Indiana searching for the right combination, it feels like the Fever are still negotiating with problems that should have been addressed before the season ever got this far.
Caitlin Clark with some mid-range action.
More movements in 23.
This is pretty nice. She's going to roll over, a little pull-up from mid-range. It is a nice addition to her game, to her bag.
This is the encouraging Caitlin Clark part. The mid-range game. The little rollover, the pull-up, the comfort inside the arc. That matters because every great scorer eventually has to punish the defense in more than one way. The 3 is the headline. The logo range is the brand. The passing is the engine. But the mid-range is what keeps defenses honest when they start selling out high, blitzing screens, pushing her off the line, and forcing her into crowds. That is one of the reasons this game is not as simple as Caitlin missed shots. Yes, the late threes were brutal. Yes, 2 for 9 from deep changes the game, but her overall development still shows up in moments like this. She is not just launching, she is adding layers, she is learning where the windows are. She is getting more comfortable taking what the defense gives her instead of always trying to create the most explosive outcome. And that is the long-term problem for the rest of the league. Even in a frustrating loss, you can see the expansion of the bag. The Fever may not have solved Minnesota yet, but Caitlin Clark is still adding counters. And when a player like that adds counters, the league eventually has to rewrite its coverage.
How about Caitlin Clark with a great, pure block shot?
Earlier in the game.
Nothing but ball, a great block shot, and they called a foul on Caitlin Clark. Stephanie White, MIA on a challenge for Caitlin. Again.
But then you get this, a clean-looking block from Caitlin Clark, and the foul is called on her. Again, the reason this plays so strongly with fans is not because every single Fever complaint must automatically be correct. It is because the pattern feels familiar. Caitlin gets physical contact. Caitlin makes a defensive play. Caitlin picks up a whistle. Stephanie White does not challenge. The broadcast moves on. Fans at home rewind the clip and ask why the most visible player in the league keeps ending up in these moments without the kind of protection they believe a franchise centerpiece should get. This is where coaching comes into the conversation. A challenge is not just about one possession. Sometimes it is about sending a message to the officials, your player, and your team. It says, we saw that. We are not letting that slide. When a star feels like she is fighting the opponent and the whistle, the coach has to decide when to use that tool. Now, coaches see angles and information the rest of us do not always see. They have assistants in their ear. They are managing timeouts. They are thinking about the full game. So it is not as simple as screaming, challenge everything. But when the same type of frustration keeps showing up, the coach becomes part of the story. And on this day, even the source clip says Stephanie White had strange moments. That matters because White had been getting more credit lately, and this game interrupted that momentum.
Caitlin Clark from 3.
They enter this game allowing
Way out. Bam. Knocked it down. Good stuff from Caitlin. Caitlin Clark gets Olivia Miles on an island and takes it to the rack.
Then Caitlin does what Caitlin does, from deep, clean release, and suddenly the whole game feels different for a second. That is the tension with Indiana. No matter how messy it gets, No matter how many matchup problems they have, no matter how many calls frustrate the fan base, they always feel one Caitlin burst away from flipping the game. That is a blessing and a trap. It is a blessing because very few teams have that kind of player. A player who can bend defensive attention from 30 feet, pass teammates open, and change the emotional temperature of a game with one possession. But it is a trap because if the team starts relying on magic, the structural problems stay alive. Minnesota did not look like a team waiting for magic. Minnesota looked like a team executing a plan. That is the difference. Indiana has moments that make you believe. Minnesota had stretches that made you understand. They were not just surviving fever runs, they were answering them. And when a team can answer Caitlin Clark threes with its own shot creation, its own guard play, and its own depth, that is when the fever's margin gets dangerously thin.
Caitlin Clark gets Olivia Miles on an island and takes it to the rack. We'll get to Olivia Miles in a minute. You guys know I like Olivia Miles. I'm not even apologetic about it. I am not. She balled out today. Caitlin Clark is the WNBA's all-time leader in assists per game. It's not even close.
That drive on Olivia Miles is a reminder that Caitlin can still attack matchups directly. She is not only a passer, she is not only a shooter. Put the wrong defender on an island, and she can get to the rim. But the reason Olivia Miles gets mentioned right after this is important. Because this game was not just about Caitlin trying to drag Indiana through. It was also about Minnesota having a young guard who answered the moment. And this is where the conversation turns from one controversial night to a much bigger basketball problem for the Fever. Minnesota is not just good because of Cheryl Reeve. They are not just good because of a slogan on a shirt. They are good because they have real players. That sounds simple, but it is the part that gets lost when the culture war angle takes over. You can be angry at ESPN. You can question the officiating. You can think Sophie Cunningham was treated unfairly. You can think the broadcast was too comfortable praising one side of the conversation. All of that can be part of the story. But none of that explains why Courtney Williams and Olivia Miles combined to carve Indiana up. None of that explains why Minnesota's lineup looked more complete. None of that explains why the Lynx kept finding answers. And that is the uncomfortable truth Indiana fans have to sit with. The controversy may be loud, but the basketball problems are real.
She balled out today. Caitlin Clark is the WNBA's all-time leader in assists per game. It's not even close. Wow, it's not even close. Not even close. Nearly 2 assists per game more than Courtney Vandersloot, who's the next one down. I tell you what, this was brutal. Lynx, Courtney Williams, 27 points, 12 of 20. Olivia Miles, 28 points, 11 of 14, 3 for 6 from three-point range.
Caitlin Clark being the WNBA's all-time leader in assists per game is the kind of stat that should completely change how people talk about her. Because for all the arguing, all the ratings debates, all the jealousy narratives, all the physicality, all the noise, the actual basketball says something very clear. She is not just a scorer, she is one of the most productive playmakers the league has ever seen on a per-game basis. Nearly 2 assists per game more than Courtney Vandersloot, according to the source clip. That is not a small gap, that is not a little edge, that is a separation. And yet even that historic playmaking did not solve Minnesota. That is why this matchup feels like a warning. If Caitlin can generate 10 assists, if Kelsey Mitchell can score 37, if Indiana can put up 100 points, and the Fever still lose by 8, then the issue is not whether Caitlin is good enough. That argument is over. The issue is whether the roster and the coaching decisions around her are sturdy enough for the teams Indiana will have to beat when the games really matter. That is also where ESPN's framing becomes even more frustrating for some fans. Because while the broadcast is amplifying Cheryl Reeve's comments and presenting her as thoughtful in this controversy, the basketball product is telling another story too. Reeve's team looked better prepared, and that is the part nobody should ignore. A coach can be praised for a social message and still be judged for what happens on the floor. A broadcast can highlight a shirt and still owe the audience hard basketball analysis. A fan can disagree with Cheryl Reeve's public stance and still admit her team was sharper. Mature analysis can hold all of that at the same time. The problem is, this league rarely gets mature analysis. It gets tribal reactions. It gets one side pretending every complaint is hate, and the other side pretending every basketball result is proof of conspiracy. This game had enough evidence to avoid both traps. Minnesota was better. Some calls were questionable. ESPN leaned into the controversy. Sophie Cunningham remained a focal point. Caitlin Clark still made history as a passer. All of those things can be true at once.
It was brutal. Lynx, Courtney Williams, 27 points, 12 of 20. Olivia Miles, 28 points, 11 of 14, 3 for 6 from three-point range. And I got to tell you, this group, Collier, McBride, Howard, Williams, Miles, they're going to be brutal to play.
Now look at the Minnesota numbers. Courtney Williams, 27 points on 12 of 20. Olivia Miles, 28 points on 11 of 14, and 3 of 6 from 3. That is a nightmare guard performance to defend. Not one player getting hot while everybody else watches. 2 guards putting pressure on the defense, hitting shots, creating rhythm, and making Indiana pay. And when the source says that group is going to be brutal to play, that is not exaggeration. That is the basketball spine of the video. Minnesota has a collection of players that can attack different parts of the floor. They have toughness, they have shot making, they have enough balance that you cannot simply load everything toward one star and hope the rest of the roster misses. Indiana, by contrast, still feels more fragile. More dependent on the right players being hot. More dependent on Caitlin solving pressure. More dependent on Mitchell scoring at a high level. More vulnerable when a lineup gets weird. That is why the Lynx may be the Fever's real measuring stick, not because of the shirt. Not because of the pre-game conversation, not because of the headlines, because stylistically, they expose the exact things Indiana has not fully fixed. Length, depth, defensive resistance, rotation clarity, late-game execution. And when those problems show up in the same game as a cultural controversy, the loss becomes louder than a normal loss. It becomes evidence for everybody's preferred argument.
It's just being real. I'm going to be honest. I've liked what I've seen from Stephanie White's coaching as of late. Didn't love it today. There were strange moments. Let me bring in Raven Johnson for a random 4 minutes. Not challenging Caitlin Clark's calls against her, fouls against her again.
This is the coaching section, and it is where the criticism gets more specific. The source says Stephanie White had been doing better lately, but did not love this game. The random Raven Johnson minutes, the lack of challenge for Caitlin, the odd rotation choices. These are not just fan complaints shouted into the void, they are the details that decide whether a team can survive against elite competition. A 4-minute rotation gamble can swing momentum. A missed challenge can cost points, fouls, and trust. Leaving a useful player on the bench can make the team smaller than it needs to be. Sticking with the wrong combination too long can turn a manageable deficit into a chase. And with Indiana, every coaching choice is under a microscope because the stakes are bigger than one game. Caitlin Clark's arrival accelerated the timeline. The Fever are not treated like a slow rebuild anymore. They are treated like a national product with immediate expectations. That is not always fair, but it is real. When you have the most talked about player in the sport, people are not going to patiently wait 3 or 4 years while the organization figures out rotations. They are going to ask why the roster was built this way. They are going to ask why certain players are not playing. They are going to ask why challenges are not used. They are going to ask why the team still looks short on size against the opponent everybody knew would be a problem. And that last part is crucial. Minnesota did not appear out of nowhere. This was the kind of team Indiana should have been preparing for.
This is going to be a very tough out. And like we were talking about before the season, this is the team you had to put a team together to get ready for. Because the Liberty are not as good. They sorely miss Sandy Brondello. But it's this team. This team could end up being...
There it is, the real basketball payoff. Minnesota could be Indiana's kryptonite. That is a stronger point than any single officiating complaint because it points to something structural. The Fever are built around a generational engine in Caitlin Clark, a dangerous scorer in Kelsey Mitchell, and an interior hub in Aaliyah Boston. That can win a lot of games. That can create huge runs. That can sell tickets, move ratings, and make Indiana one of the most watched teams in the sport. But when the opponent has the right mix of perimeter scoring, physicality, length, and coaching discipline, Indiana's weaknesses get pulled into the open. That is why this game mattered. Not because Indiana lost once. Good teams lose. Not because Caitlin missed threes. Great shooters miss. Not because Sophie Cunningham got caught in another controversy-adjacent game. That has become part of the WNBA's current reality. It mattered because Minnesota showed a repeatable formula. Pressure Indiana's guards. Make Caitlin work for clean threes. Attack the Fever defense with multiple creators. Force the bench into uncomfortable minutes. Make Indiana decide between offense and size. Keep answering runs so the crowd never fully flips the game. That is how you beat a team with star power. You do not panic when the star makes a play. You make the rest of the roster prove it can match you for 40 minutes. And right now, Minnesota looks built for that fight.
Yeah, it was a tough game. It was. It was an entertaining game, and the Fever had some chances. They didn't get it done. Tell me what you think. I've got a full video that's coming after this on the Sophie rally, people that showed up, big names that showed up in support of Sophie Cunningham, and women only in women's sports. Again, it's unbelievable that that's controversial, but here we are.
This is where the two stories finally collide. On the floor, Minnesota looked like a serious contender, and Indiana looked like a team still searching for answers. Off the floor, Cheryl Reeve's shirt, ESPN's praise, Sophie Cunningham's presence, and the larger women's sports debate turned a competitive game into a cultural flashpoint. And that is why people are reacting so strongly. They are not only reacting to a final score, they are reacting to the feeling that the WNBA keeps stepping into the same fire and then acting surprised when fans argue about it. If the league wants to be a major sports property, then it has to accept major sports scrutiny. That means fans will criticize officiating. They will question broadcasts. They will debate coaching. They will challenge roster construction. They will react when political or social messages are placed in the middle of a game presentation. And they will definitely notice when a player like Sophie Cunningham becomes part of the story before, during, and after the basketball itself. But the Fever also have to be honest with themselves. They cannot hide behind controversy. They cannot turn every loss into a referendum on the refs or the media. They gave up too much to Minnesota's guards. They did not get enough from the bench. They had strange rotation moments. They had chances late and did not finish them. That is the balance. You can say ESPN's framing was heavy-handed. You can say the elbow sequence looked bad. You can say Caitlin deserved a challenge on that block. You can say Cheryl Reeve knew exactly how much attention that shirt would get. You can also say Minnesota earned the win. The hardest truth is usually the one that refuses to pick only one lane.
And ESPN. Yeesh. Peace. I'm out. Till next time.
Thanks for watching the show. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe.
So now the question is simple. Was this game mainly about Minnesota exposing Indiana's basketball flaws, or was it about ESPN and the WNBA turning another Fever game into a culture war battleground? Because depending on which answer you pick, you are going to see the entire night differently. If you think Minnesota exposed Indiana, then the takeaway is roster construction, coaching, depth, and whether the Fever can actually solve this matchup before it matters more. If you think the bigger story is the broadcast and the controversy, then the takeaway is that the league still has a serious trust problem with a large part of its audience. But maybe the most honest answer is that both things happened at the same time. Minnesota won the basketball game. ESPN helped frame the culture war conversation. Sophie Cunningham stayed right in the middle of the storm. Caitlin Clark put up another playmaking milestone, but missed the kind of shots that usually become her signature moments. Stephanie White had decisions that will be questioned. Cheryl Reeve's team looked prepared, and her shirt made sure the game would be discussed far beyond the box score. That is why this one does not just disappear as another 108-100 loss in August. It sticks, because it gives every side something to point at. Fever fans can point at the whistles. Critics can point at the loss. ESPN defenders can point at Cheryl Reeve's comments. Culture war commentators can point at the shirt. Basketball analysts can point at Minnesota's guard play. And Indiana's front office should be pointing at the roster gaps that keep showing up against the teams they eventually have to beat. So pick a side in the comments. Was this a basketball warning, a media problem, or both at once? Like the video, subscribe for more, and tell me which part of this game told you the most about where the Fever really stand.